Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Father Gruner, for the invitation. Thank you all for coming out. I used to be from North Jersey. Now I'm a son of the South, Richmond, Virginia. So, the talk today, the title is Your Rights as Catholics. And I guess I'd like to begin by maybe distancing myself a little bit from rights talk as such. I mean, it's a commonplace to speak of rights. And even Pope Leo did so, adopting the vocabulary of the modern world. But the problem with rights is that you get into a question of entitlement and the abuse of rights, and rights are something you can dispense with at your pleasure. So I would prefer to talk more in terms of duties in this presentation. So if we speak of rights, we should be speaking of our right as Catholics to fulfill our duties as Catholics. So the rights are always tied to duties. In this case, the duty to speak about and resist certain elements of the crisis in the church. And anyone who doesn't think there's a crisis in the church at this point is in a coma. Now, the question of rights connected to our duties as Catholics arises in the context of obedience. We call ourselves traditionalists, for lack of a better name, and that in itself is remarkable, that one Catholic should be distinguished from another by the word tradition. We call ourselves traditionalists, for lack of a better name, and we're told by our critics, who I have described as neo-Catholics, for lack of a better name, that we are guilty of a lack of obedience. Now, the first question I would pose is whether this is even a matter of obedience. What teaching of the Second Vatican Council, what teaching of the popes since the council, what law of the Church binds us to adopt a single one of the novelties that have come into the life of the Church since the Second Vatican Council? And the answer, I think we all know, not one. There is no teaching that compels us to engage in ecumenism, no law of the Church that says we must participate in dialogue. There isn't even a law that requires us to attend the new liturgy. And even before Summorum Pontificum, the Vatican was intimating again and again that, in fact, Paul VI had never abolished the traditional Latin Mass de jure as a matter of law, even though de facto it had been suppressed. And even before Summorum Pontificum, Cardinal Ratzinger had admitted that it would actually be unthinkable for the power of the keys, the power that belongs to Peter alone, to be used against the Church's own liturgical tradition. And he said in a quote that is not well known enough, and I'm quoting, "It is good to recall here what Cardinal Newman observed, that the Church, throughout her history, has never abolished nor forbidden Orthodox liturgical forms, which would be quite alien to the spirit of the Church. The authority of the Church has the power to define and limit the use of such rites in different historical situations, but she never just purely and simply forbids them. Thus, the Council ordered a reform of the liturgical books, but it did not prohibit the former books." Now, Paul VI, in another little-known incident, admitted as much when he met with Father Jean-Marie Charles Roux, who was then 90 years old. And this elderly priest said to Paul VI, "For 18 months I have celebrated the new Mass, but I cannot continue. I was ordained to celebrate the old Mass, and I want to return to it. Will you permit me to do so?" And what did Paul VI say on this occasion? "Certainly, I never forbade celebration of the old Mass. I have only offered an alternative." Now, why did Paul's private advice to this elderly priest not apply with equal force to every priest in the Catholic Church throughout the post-conciliar period? Why did we have to wait for Summorum Pontificum to tell us that in fact, the traditional missal had never been abrogated, and as the explanatory letter says, was in principle always permitted. Why do we have to wait that long? The answer is that the truth was hidden from us. For 40 years, the mere appearance of a command, the mere suggestion that we were required to obey the liturgical revolutionaries, was used to cow the faithful into submission. And we know that when the infamous Annibale Bugnini tried to get an official declaration from the Holy See that the Mass of all time had been definitively abrogated, he was rebuked with the statement from the Vatican Secretary of State that to do this would be an odious act in the face of liturgical tradition. Now, we've heard that quote before. Many traditionalist writers have mentioned that. But not many have mentioned that Bugnini persisted in his attempt to get such an official declaration. And the Vatican finally relented to the extent of telling him this: you can send a notification that the definitive suppression of the Latin Mass has occurred with the promulgation of Paul VI's Missal, provided you do so privately in an unofficial letter with no protocol number. Why? So that they could deny later on that there had ever been any such suppression. This is the kind of dishonesty we're dealing with. It is what I've called in the book I wrote, The Great Facade, a collection of things which have been erected to conceal what the Church has handed down over the centuries, or a series of novelties imposed upon us, a facade hiding the faith that was always there, is still there today, and will always be there. The whole thing has depended upon, the revolution in the Church, the appearance of a command. Father Gruner has spoken about this many times. The appearance of a command given by people who don't want to actually give a command. That's why Paul VI never forbade the Latin Mass definitively, and that's why he said privately that he never did so. That's why Bugnini was told, you can tell people that, but only unofficially, in a letter with no protocol number. Now, let's assume, however, that there was a command. Let's assume we had been commanded to embrace these novelties, the new ecumenism, the new dialogue, the new liturgy, the new whatever. Well, first of all, we do not belong to a Gnostic sect. We know our faith. We don't receive our faith in bulletins from the Holy See like lawyers get pocket parts that go in the back of statute books. The annual edition of the Catholic Faith, 2014 pocket part. We know our faith because the faith is timeless. The faith is contained in dogmatic definitions. Again, Father Gruner has spoken repeatedly about the nature of these dogmatic definitions. They are ex se of themselves irreformable. They can't change. And they must always be understood, as Vatican I insisted, in the same sense. And there is to be no withdrawal from the original meaning under the pretext of a deeper understanding. The definitions explain themselves. You read them and you know what your faith is. For example, the Council of Florence in 1431, meeting from 1431 to 1449, expressed this definition of the necessity of membership in the Church. Those not living within the Catholic Church, within not only pagans but also Jews, heretics, and schismatics, cannot become participants in eternal life, but will depart into everlasting fire, which was prepared for the devil and his angels, unless before the end of life the same have been added to the flock. Not one iota of that definition has changed. There is no different understanding of that. Now, there's room for discussion about how one is added to the flock, but no one dies and goes to heaven other than as a member of the Catholic Church. There could be a baptism of desire in some way known only to God. Some exceptional cases may involve people who are not formal members and end up in the beatific vision through means known to God, but they do so by becoming part of the Catholic flock. How that happens, we don't know. We aren't given to know it. And it certainly can't become a rule of the faith. On the liturgy, the same council, the Council of Florence, said this: if anyone says that the received and approved rites customarily used in the Catholic Church for the solemn administration of the sacraments can be changed into other new rites by any pastor in the Church whatsoever, let him be anathema. And this is why Paul VI never dared to definitively abrogate the traditional Roman Missal. He created a new rite, but he didn't change the old rite into a new rite. He created, as he said to Father Charles Roux in private, an alternative. It's all it ever was. It's all it ever will be. And with Summorum Pontificum, we know that for a fact. They may call the new Mass the ordinary rite and the old Mass the extraordinary rite. That doesn't change the reality that the extraordinary rite is the received and approved rite, and the new Mass is a novelty in the Church. It did not change the old rite. It was introduced alongside it. And Cardinal Ratzinger said the introduction of that new rite was a break in the history of the liturgy whose consequences could only be tragic. That's what the future Pope Benedict XVI said. Now, it's interesting that at the Council of Florence, where the Church resoundingly affirmed the necessity of membership in the Catholic Church for salvation, we had the great reunion with the Orthodox. It was short-lived, but there was a reunion between the Orthodox churches in Rome. The representatives of the Orthodox churches were practically ripped to pieces when they returned home with the agreement. And it was, as I say, short-lived, but it was at this council that there was an actual reunion of the Eastern and Western churches for a time, despite this affirmation of the absolute necessity of belonging to the Catholic Church for salvation, which of course implies submission to the Roman Pontiff, where he can require submission. This is what I'll be getting to. And it's interesting that at the Council of Florence, one of the few of the Orthodox representatives who sincerely embraced this reunion of the East and the West was Isidore of Kiev. Kiev, in what is now Ukraine, is where the conversion of Europe began, with the baptism of the emperor and the conversion of what is now Eastern Europe to the Holy Catholic religion. And so for about 60 years, the Eastern European Christians were Catholics before the schism in 1054. Now, Florence defined dogma. And authority is not the same as dogma. If the faith and dogma were the same as mere authority, then the practice of the faith would merely be obedience to whatever authority says. But that would mean that the content of the faith is irrelevant. All that would matter is what the authority says today. And this is what Protestantism is. This is the feature of Protestantism known as nominalism. Doctrine is whatever the authority-propounding doctrine might say it is in a given church, and if you don't like that doctrine, you found another church, and the nominalist head of that church tells you what the doctrine is for that church. There's no objective content. There are no infallible definitions that never change. So authority becomes mixed with dogma in Protestantism, and as a result, both dogma and authority are destroyed. There is no church any longer, because the church is not anchored in infallible definitions, which ex se of themselves are unchanging. And to go with those definitions, received and approved rites of the sacraments, which cannot simply be abolished, because they support the very dogmas that are the foundation of the faith. Now, contrary to what these people I call neo-Catholics would suggest, authority is not infallible in its commands. And they may object that we don't say the Pope is infallible in everything he does, but they certainly act as if he were, because even when the Pope makes a misstep, even when the Pope causes scandal, they refuse to stand up to him and say, Holy Father, you're wrong. So effectively for them, we have an infallible Pope, or when he says something that is clearly indefensible, we have a non-existent Pope. So in many respects, these neo-Catholics are effectively sedevacantists. They spent the last year of this current pontificate acting as if the Pope hasn't said what he said, as if we don't have a Pope. He's like the crazy ant in the attic. That's their approach to the crisis. It isn't the Catholic approach, as I'll explain to you. Our faith does not teach that authority is per se infallible in its commands. On the contrary, our faith teaches us that it is quite possible that in disciplinary matters, the Pope might mislead us, and even in doctrinal matters. What did St. Paul mean when he said that if we, meaning the apostles or an angel from heaven, should preach to you a gospel other than the one that has been given to us, let him be anathema? He foresaw a time when even the upper hierarchy might preach false doctrine. What saves us in that case? what Father Gruner has always talked about, the dogmas of the faith, defined infallibly by the Church, which are always there as landmarks to guide us, no matter what the current occupant of the Holy See or the local bishop might have to say to the contrary. That's why we have defined dogma. That's where the Church's infallibility comes into play. And respecting the liturgy, listen to what the New Catechism says. Even the supreme authority of the Church, the Pope, in other words, may not change the liturgy arbitrarily, but only in the obedience of faith and with religious respect for the mystery of the liturgy. That's the New Catechism of the Catholic Church, section 1124. Do you think that the new Mass represents a non-arbitrary change of the liturgy that was done with the obedience of faith and with respect for the mystery of the liturgy? Do you see respect for the mystery of the liturgy in the typical Novus Ordo parish here in New Jersey? I lived here for 30 years. I certainly didn't see it. There are some noble exceptions, but they managed to achieve some degree of respect for the Blessed Sacrament and the mystery that is at the center of the Mass in spite of the new Mass and the reforms, to the extent that they approached the old Mass and the old way of worship, which is a timeless way of worship. So it is possible for someone in authority to depart from the faith in his teaching or in his disciplinary commands. And it is possible for us to know this objectively. What did Cardinal Newman say about the Arian crisis? He said that the church which is taught kept the faith better than most of the teaching church during that time, because the laity who had been taught the faith did not forget it, and many members of the hierarchy did forget it. So the laity held on to the faith where the hierarchy did not. And they were able to do so not because they're Protestants exercising private judgment, but because they know what the church teaches, what she teaches infallibly, what is found in the infallible definitions of the dogmas of the faith. And they knew that not all commands of ecclesiastical superiors are God's commands, and that, in fact, some of these commands may be contrary to God's commands and have to be disobeyed. As always, St. Thomas Aquinas clears up this confusion, which exists in the minds of these people I call neo-Catholics, who confuse authority with dogma all the time. In the Summa Theologica, Thomas addressed the seemingly telling objection that religious, in making their profession, take vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. They vow obedience. Now, a religious is bound to observe chastity and poverty in all things, says St. Thomas, stating the objection. Therefore, he is bound to obey in all things. Now, this is someone who has taken a vow of obedience that none of us has taken, unless you happen to be a member of an order that has taken a vow. We lay people don't take such a vow. Even as to those who take a vow of obedience to superiors, are not bound to obey the superior in all things. On the contrary, says St. Thomas, it is written, citing Acts 5:29, we ought to obey God rather than men. Now, sometimes the things commanded by a superior are against God. Therefore, superiors are not to be obeyed in all things. That is the angelic doctor speaking. And if that is true of religious who take a vow of obedience, it is all the more true of the laity and the secular clergy. Now, whether a command or even a teaching is against God is, first of all, a matter of objective, verifiable truth. When we're talking about the defined dogmas of the faith, and when you're talking about the liturgy that has been handed down to us over the centuries, which, as even the New Catechism says, not even the Pope may change arbitrarily. Now, in closer cases where we're not sure, we have to follow our conscience. There is a role for the Catholic conscience in these matters. You have to do what your conscience tells you if your conscience is well informed. Let me give you an example. Suppose the Pope were to say, I command that every marble altar in the Western Church be destroyed by sledgehammers on Wednesday afternoon. Would anybody have to obey such an insane command? I mean, he's not defying a dogma. He's not, strictly speaking, abolishing a Mass, but he is giving a ridiculous and indeed insane command. Nobody would obey that command. They would say, thank you very much, we'll talk to you when you recover your sanity. Now, let me ask a question. What is worse, ordering the destruction of all the altars in the Western Church, or ordering the destruction of the Roman Rite itself? So, what Catholics did when they were confronted with this insanity, knowing, of course, that Paul VI had never actually abolished the Roman Rite, they went to chapels, in hotels sometimes, or independent chapels. When someone in the Vatican said Paul VI abolished the old Mass, our reply was, "We don't think so. Check with us when you come to your senses." And we held on to the traditional liturgy until the Vatican finally acknowledged through the indults in 1981 and 1984, and ultimately Summorum Pontificum and the chartering of the Fraternity of St. Peter, that the old Mass was not prohibited, could not be prohibited, and never will be prohibited. It's part of what the Holy Ghost has forged over the centuries and handed down for us as our patrimony and our birthright as Catholics. It simply can't be destroyed, because ecclesiastical tradition tied to the dogma cannot be eliminated any more than the dogmas themselves can be eliminated. No pope can just sweep them away. And this is what Cardinal Ratzinger said, and this is what he did as pope to implement this certain conviction that these things, what is, as he put it, what is sacred then is sacred now and must be given its proper place in the church. And it was only because of what some people would call disobedience on the part of Catholics that the pilot light, so to speak, of the defense of the traditional liturgy was kept on for all those years when ecclesiastical revolutionaries were trying to snuff it out. Now, traditionalists have been accused by various neo-Catholic critics of what one of them calls a temptation to Protestantism. This has to be the most ludicrous accusation leveled against traditionalists, because what are the post-conciliar revolutionaries who have wrecked the commonwealth of the church, what are they themselves but not those engaged in Protestantizing the Catholic Church? Who can deny that the Catholic Church has, relatively speaking, been Protestantized? They are not merely tempted to Protestantism, they have tried to implement it in the Catholic Church. You think that's an extreme statement? Consider what Monsignor Klaus Gamber said in the Reform of the Roman Liturgy, to which the future Pope Benedict wrote a laudatory preface, calling Gamber a visionary and one of the great liturgists in the history of the Church. Here is what Gamber said about the condition of the liturgy after the post-conciliar reforms. Quote, "A Catholic who ceased to be an active member of the Church for the past generation, and who, having decided to return to the Church, wants to become religiously active again, probably would not recognize today's Church as the one he had left. Simply by entering a Catholic Church, particularly if it happens to be one of ultra-modern design, he would feel as if he had entered a strange, foreign place. He will think that he must have come to the wrong address, and that he accidentally ended up in some other Christian religious community." The future Pope Benedict glowingly praised that assessment of the state of the liturgy in the years leading up to Summorum Pontificum. So I think we've heard quite enough of the lame accusation that traditionalists are like protesting Protestants. Has our situation become so confused that Catholics are now to be viewed as Protestants because they want nothing to do with the Protestant errors that have invaded the church, especially in the field of the liturgy and in the field of ecumenism? If anyone is guilty of a temptation to Protestantism, it's a number of these neo-Catholic critics, many of whom were, not coincidentally, converts from Protestantism. And I don't think they've ever lost their Protestant conception of what the papacy is. It's a kind of a Protestant Americanist conception. This idea that the Pope can do no wrong, or if he does do wrong, no one can say anything about it, is really almost peculiarly an American phenomenon. You don't see this in Europe. The long history of the Church in Europe, to put it as crudely as possible, consists of people who, when they see the Pope doing something untoward or scandalous, as one commentator said, Brendan Dougherty, they pick up the rotten cabbages and say, "Get out of here," and they start throwing cabbages. Because they recognize the Pope for what he is, in his person, a fallible human being who occupies the office of the Vicar of Christ, but is not immune from error. And when he makes error, the people know it. The common Catholic can know it. And we see it again and again in church history. Go study the lives of the popes, and you'll see some pretty hair-raising scandals, not just involving misbehavior of a moral sort, but even doctrinal controversies, like the one involving John the 22nd, who insisted again and again and again that there is no particular judgment. After death, everybody goes to sleep, and then there's the general judgment. Everyone wakes up. Nothing happens in the interim. This is clearly heretical, although there hadn't been a defined dogma at that point. And the common people knew he was wrong. The theologians in Paris knew he was wrong, and they told him he was wrong after he asked them to consider the matter in a commission that he convened. And he had to retract his error because the people knew, and the theologians knew, because they know the faith. Because the faith is not what the Pope says it is. The Pope is beholden to the faith, not the faith to the Pope. So now I know you're asking, what is he going to say about Pope Francis? The Pope in the room. Well, what can I say that hasn't already been said? I mean, I could go through the litany of his various statements, which have ended up garnering him the hysterical praise of the entire world media, something that has never happened with any pope in history. The cover of the leading gay magazine? Are you kidding me? Something is seriously wrong. The cover of Time magazine? The cover of the Rolling Stone? The world's accolades? The greatest pope ever? What does Scripture say? What does Scripture say? Be careful if the world speaks well of you, because that's what they said of the false prophets of old. No, I'm not saying Francis is simply a false prophet, but he has said many things that have led to immense confusion in the church. I'm not going to list them all today. You know them all. You've read them all. It's not my function here today. I want to discuss an aspect of this problem with Pope Francis that maybe hasn't been addressed as thoroughly as it should be. And that is this. The problem isn't a particular statement here or there of the Pope that causes scandal. That has to be addressed. We have to complain about that. We have the right to complain about it. The problem is that the church is in the grips of a veritable ideology. An ideology which is foreign to the Catholic faith. Now, you may think that's another extreme statement on my part. Let me talk to you a little bit about an address given by Monsignor Pozzo, who was and still is the secretary of the Ecclesia Dei Commission, which is supposed to be responsible for administering the implementation of Summorum Pontificum throughout the world. Monsignor Guido Pozzo gave this address on July 2nd, 2010, to the priests of the priestly fraternity of St. Peter at their seminary in Vigratsbart. This is a very high-ranking Vatican prelate with a very responsible position. And here is what he had to say. He says that there is what we may call the conciliar, or more exactly, the paraconciliar ideology, which was imposed on the council from the beginning and which overshadowed it. And this ideology, he said, involves a type of internal conditioning in the subsequent reading of the acts of the council and the documents of the council. And this paraconciliar ideology, he says, has operated in large part towards a mystification of the council, the greatest council ever. We must accept Vatican II, although they never really explain what they mean when they say we must accept Vatican II, since in point of fact, Vatican II did not actually change the dogmas of the faith. He says that in this paraconciliar ideology, 1968 signifies a new form of the church in rupture with the past, even if the roots of this rupture have been present for some time in Catholic circles. And I would add my own comment to this. We've reached the point where this crisis, this ideological invasion of the church, really has very little to do with the documents of Vatican II. At this point, many of which can now be cited against the progressives who are increasingly coming back into dominance in the church. He says, Monsignor Pozzo, that there are several factors to this ideology. The first is the renunciation of anathema. That is the clear contradistinction between orthodoxy and heresy. I spoke to you about the dogmas of the faith. I talked to you about how the church anathematizes those who dissent from dogmas. There's been a renunciation of the anathema, which means a renunciation of the defense of dogma, which means a loss of the understanding of and respect for dogma. which means that, as Our Lady said, in Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved, ... with the Vatican hiding the rest of that statement, which obviously goes on to say, in many other places in the church, dogma will not be preserved. That's because, as part of this ideology, we've renounced anathema. The anathema, which means we've renounced the clear distinction between orthodoxy and heresy. Who can deny it? That there's been a complete obfuscation now in the preaching of church between heresy and orthodoxy. Romano Amerios goes even further and says there's a loss of essences in post-conciliar thinking. What does he mean by that? We've lost the ability to distinguish one thing from another. To say something as simple as this is evil and that is good, this is right and this is wrong. You see it in almost every pronouncement of modern churchmen. They waffle on everything. And at the foundation of that is the attack on dogma and the renunciation of the anathema. How are you going to defend dogma if you don't condemn those who attack it? If you refuse to condemn those who attack it? If you coddle those who attack it? While persecuting those who defend it, which is what is happening in the church today, just the way it did during the Arian crisis when St. Basil the Great, and this is why, one of the reasons why they call him the Great, said only one offense is now vigorously persecuted, a strict adherence to our fathers' traditions. The second factor of this paraconciliar ideology is what Monsignor Pozzo calls the translation of Catholic thought into the categories of modernity. The opening of the church to the concerns and needs begotten by modernity. How many times have we heard this? Oh, at Vatican II, the church decided to make her vocabulary more accessible to the modern world so the modern world would understand her teaching better. When in the history of the church has there been so little understanding of Catholic teaching? When has its meaning been so completely befogged and obscured by endless palaver and ambiguity on the part of churchmen? Never before, except perhaps with respect to at least one dogma during the time of the Arian crisis. And the irony is, as Monsignor Pozzo says, neo-modernistic and secularist theology sought an encounter with the modern world just as modern was beginning to dissolve. Here's the council engaging in this fatuous optimism about political modernity at the very time it was all crumbling around them. Now is the time to be optimistic after nearly a century of the worst pessimism from pope after pope about the inevitable fate of this civilization if it did not return to the church and the law of the gospel. Now we're going to be optimistic. It's like the church's approach to the approach of certain churchmen to evolution. They're about 75 years behind the times. They've decided evolution makes sense when more and more thinking people are looking at the scientific evidence which shows that it's utter nonsense. Whenever the church tries to be hip, it's always about 75 years late. And the result is embarrassing and damaging to the faith. Now, there's another element which I'll get to. But first, regarding the second element, Pozzo says this idea of an aggiornamento, updating the church's teaching, which in reality constituted a progressive and at times unconscious blending of the church's mentality with the reigning subjectivism and relativism, is the problem. The church blended her thinking with that of modern thinking, which means the church, at least in her human element, and what churchmen are saying, became relativistic and subjectivistic. This surrender, said Monsignor Pozzo, has brought with it disorientation among the faithful, depriving them of the certainty of faith and of hope in eternal life as the highest end of human existence. What did John Paul II admit in crossing the threshold of hope? He said that churchmen have lost sight of the four last things: death, judgment, heaven, hell. He admits this. He says churchmen have lost the courage to preach the threat of hell because of the new eschatological vision of the council. This is an admission of John Paul II. Monsignor Pozzo was saying the same thing in 2010. And then the third factor that he mentions, the interpretation of the aggiornamento, desired by Vatican Council II. The paraconciliar ideology, he says, and this is an ideology, it's not Catholic dogma, it's a human way of thinking. the ideology which was spread above all by groups of neo-modernist Catholic intellectuals and by secularist worldly centers of power, understood and proposed the term aggiornamento, updating, as a demolition of the church in the face of the modern world, from antagonism to receptivity. Ideological modernity has led to the idea of a reconciliation between the church and the modern world, and it led, paradoxically, he says, to forgetting that the anti-Christian spirit of the world continues to be at work in history and in culture. That's obviously what has happened. Churchmen have forgotten that the world is not our friend. And by the world, I mean the powers and principalities of this world. Not every soul in it, but those who run the show, who are consciously or unconsciously instruments of the adversary, powers and principalities. This is what I mean by the world, and this world has always been at enmity with the church. Churchmen have forgotten this. They want to be pals with the world. Exhibit A, Cardinal Dolan. I could rest my case right there. But now, Monsignor Pozo, how many times have you heard the quote about how the smoke of Satan has entered the temple of God? We've all heard this quote 1,000 times. The New Catholic would say, that's apocryphal. He never said that. They wouldn't be able to prove that. We do cite the source. But Monsignor Pozo quotes the entire context of that statement. And I think it's important that I read it to you today. Here's what Pope Paul VI said in 1972. And it's all the more true today, obviously. This is the Pope speaking. And if Pope Francis doesn't see this, that's so much the worse for our Pope. Because Paul VI sure saw it, and he had the courage to admit it. By some fissure, there has entered into the temple of God the smoke of Satan. There is doubt, uncertainty, problems, unrest. Doubt has entered our consciences, not just a few modernists. And it has entered through the windows which were meant to have been opened to the light. Remember those windows that were thrown open? This state of uncertainty reigns even in the church. It was hoped that after the council there would be a day of sunlight in the history of the church. Instead, there came a day of clouds, of darkness, of groping, of uncertainty. How did this happen? The Pope asks. We will confide our thoughts to you. There has been an interference from an adverse power. His name is the devil, that mysterious being to whom frequent allusion is made even in the epistle of St. Peter. Now, how did Sister Lucia, who knew the third secret of Fatima in its entirety, describe the same situation? 2 words. You remember what they are? Exactly. And this is what Paul VI is talking about. Anyone who denies that the church is in the grips of diabolical disorientation today, and it's ridiculous that I, a layman, have to stand here and tell churchmen about it, anyone who denies it is simply blind, or has willfully blinded himself to the reality. Now, here's what Monsignor Pozo says. And by the way, that quote appears in the Insegnamenti, the Italian translation, the multi-volume set of the official speeches of the Pope, the Vatican edition, Volume 10, page 707. Have you got that, Mr. Shea? The quote really exists, and this is what Paul VI said. And to Mr. Shea and Mr. Aiken and all the other neo-Catholic spinmeisters, I would say this from the podium today. Pope Paul VI was not talking about a few wayward modernist theologians. He was talking about the condition of the church only 7 years after the Second Vatican Council, which is rather flippantly but fairly described as the Second Vatican disaster. Now, Monsignor Pozo, and not because of the literal text, by the way, but because of what they permitted through their ambiguities and debatable interpretations. Now, some would go further and say there are positive errors. I don't go there. I don't think we have to go there. That's a debatable subject. But as I said earlier, we've gone far beyond the literal text of Vatican II at this point. That's just a talisman that they hold up for whatever they want to do today. Now, here's what Monsignor Pozo says about what Paul VI said. Does he say that this was an exaggeration? Does he say this was a few modernist theologians, like the neo-Catholics do, like Mr. Shea does, like Mr. Aiken says, like Catholic Answers says, which hasn't really been giving us any Catholic answers lately? Is that what Monsignor Pozzo says? Here's what he says. Unfortunately, the effects as enumerated by Paul VI have not disappeared. A foreign way of thinking has entered into the Catholic world. The Catholic world. Stirring up confusion, seducing many souls, and disorienting the faithful, as in diabolical disorientation. There is a spirit of self-demolition that pervades modernism, which has wrested control over, among other things, most of the Catholic press. Now, my only complaint about Monsignor Pozzo's courageous address, which was too soon forgotten, is that he conspicuously omits the role of the hierarchy in all of this. Paul VI really didn't. He was talking about everyone in the church, not just the faithful, not just Catholic journalists, but the hierarchy. And when Pope Benedict said in his address to the Roman Curia, just before he resigned from the papacy, that a virtual council had produced calamities and disasters and empty seminaries and convents and the banalization of the liturgy, when he referred to the council of the media, what was he really saying? The media didn't give us the new Mass. The media didn't empty the seminary. 60 Minutes didn't tell the seminarians to leave. The virtual council was implemented by the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. The virtual council is the council they gave us under the governance of a series of popes. I'm sorry, but that's the reality. And if we're going to condemn the condition of the church and say that disasters and calamities have occurred, as the last pope admitted, we have to lay the blame where it belongs. Of course, we share part of the blame. Our own failings go into the mix, but the leadership of the church is above all responsible. The shepherd has more responsibility than the sheep. And when the shepherds have gone astray, the sheep have gone astray with them, even though, as I said, we should have kept the faith, and many of us have, in spite of the changes. We had a duty to keep the faith. And our own sins have contributed to this problem. Even the sins of we who acknowledge the situation for what it is. Because there is a temptation in our movement, not to Protestantism, but to bitterness. Some people in this movement enjoy the crisis. I don't get any great kicks out of commenting on it. I'd love to get up here and sing hosannas to the Pope. I was a great fan of Benedict. I didn't like everything he did. He went to Assisi. He had some abysmal liturgies. The one at the World Youth Day comes to mind in Australia. But I was a great defender of Pope Benedict because he was doing things that had to be defended. He was doing wonderful things for the church to try to steer the bark of Peter back in the right direction. Mike Matt told me once about how he had a friend who had been working with him for years, and one day he realized, oh, he's an African American. That's when I knew I wasn't a racist, he said. He never really thought about the man's color. Well, he and I were at the conclave in 2005 when Benedict came out on the balcony. And I had tears in my eyes. That's when I knew I wasn't a traditionalist because I get my jollies criticizing popes. I'm a traditionalist because for whatever I'm worth in the scheme of things, which isn't much, however inadequate I am as a Catholic, I do love the church. I love the faith. And I'm happy when the Pope does the right thing. I'm overjoyed when the Pope does the right thing. So we need to fight that temptation in the movement. But in terms of this ideology, let me move, as I come close to the conclusion, to the most difficult part of this speech. The ideology clearly involves the Pope himself. He may not be aware of this. Many Catholics, not just traditionalists now, have expressed alarm about his many statements. Again, I'm not going to go through the litany of the things he's said and done that have earned him the praise of the entire world. But I will say this. He seems to be subject to this paraconciliar ideology, which goes beyond the council, which despises the past of the church, which looks down on people who stand up for the traditions of the church, and belittles them. How many times has he insulted traditional Catholics? One person writing on the CNN blog compiled a Pope Francis little book of insults. I mean, let's be fair. The Pope who says, "Who am I to judge?" has spent half his time judging people. And most of the negative judgments are leveled against traditionalists, including the famous line that we are self-absorbed Promethean Neo-Pelagians. And this is where the ideology comes in. This is paragraph 94 to 95 of Evangelii Gaudium. He speaks of self-absorbed Promethean Neo-Pelagianism, of those who ultimately trust only in their own powers and feel superior to others because they observe certain rules or remain intransigently faithful to a particular Catholic style from the past. That's an alarming statement. A Catholic style from the past. Is that what the faith is? To this way of thinking? A style that changes? Can you reduce everything Catholics were before the Second Vatican Council in terms of how they lived their faith to a style? And if it's only a style, what about the styles that were introduced in the 1960s? Aren't they about as withered as a lava lamp today? Shouldn't we think about getting rid of those styles, if it's style we're talking about? But then he goes on to say, a supposed soundness of doctrine. What does he mean, a supposed soundness of doctrine? Is the doctrine sound or not? A supposed soundness of doctrine or discipline leads to a narcissistic and authoritarian elitism, whereby instead of evangelizing, well, how do you evangelize without doctrine? One analyzes and classifies others. Well, he's just spent the paragraph analyzing and classifying people. There's about 9 classifications in one sentence. Then he goes on to say that there's an insidious worldliness. In some people we see an ostentatious preoccupation for the liturgy, for doctrine, for the church's prestige. Imagine that. Being preoccupied with liturgy, doctrine, and the church's prestige in the world, the image of the bride of Christ. What kind of a Catholic is preoccupied with those things? Does the Pope realize the implications of what he's saying? I don't know. Does this reflect the post-conciliar ideology? I'm afraid it does. It's an ideological way of thinking. It's a human way of thinking. And the irony is he's condemning worldliness, as he calls it, insidious worldliness, in the process of making a very worldly assessment of people who are just trying to keep the faith, calling them narcissists. Now, I ask it with all due respect, where is the humility in this kind of a pronouncement against the Pope's own subjects? And if anyone was ostentatiously preoccupied with the liturgy, wasn't it his predecessor, Pope Benedict, who said that what was sacred then is sacred now and must be given its proper place? Is that an ostentatious preoccupation with the liturgy? He moved a mountain to try to bring back the traditional Mass. And he brought down the hatred of the world upon himself when he did that and lifted the excommunications of the Society of St. Pius X, and he became a victim of the ideology. Remember what he said in his letter explaining why he lifted the excommunications. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, it seems that in our society there has to be one group that everybody can hate, that is never allowed to be tolerated. And when the Pope reaches out to them, he too can be hated. That's how he was treated by the ideologues. And now, God help us, we have a Pope who's talking about people who are trying to hold fast to tradition as Pelagians, narcissists, and ostentatiously preoccupied hypocrites, he's calling us. He actually used the word. He talks about hypocritical Christians who look like holy cards. Who are these people? Who is he talking about? Now, another example of the ideology is this Archbishop Nunzio Galantino. The Pope is in the process of restructuring the Episcopal Conference in Italy so that effectively he's in charge of it, which is contrary to this whole idea of collegiality. I mean, the bishops' conferences are a novelty. They've democratized the church, and the results have not been good. But in this case, the Pope is making an exception. He's trying to put the bishops' conference under his direct control for certain purposes. So he summoned Archbishop Galantino from the north of Italy, I forget which diocese he's in, to Rome to be the Secretary General, directly under him, in control of the entire Episcopal Conference. And he explained to the people of his archdiocese that, I must have him here. It is essential that I have this man in Rome. My apologies to you for taking away this wonderful churchman, but I need him in Rome. Apparently, he needed him in Rome to say this, quote, my wish for the Italian church is that it is able to listen without any taboo to the arguments in favor of married priests, the Eucharist for the divorced, and homosexuality. This is the man the Pope urgently brought to Rome to help him with his work. And we know exactly what's going on with Cardinal Casper. I'm sorry to say it, but it is apparently true. From the moment he became Pope, on that plane ride to Brazil, During the press conference until then, the Pope has again and again and again sounded the theme about finding a way to allow people living in a state of public adultery to receive Holy Communion, contrary to the teaching of John Paul II in Familiaris Consortio, paragraphs 40 to 41. And one of his functionaries, I think it was Brazzaville, when confronted with the teaching of John Paul II, insisting that the divorced and remarried cannot approach the Blessed Sacrament unless they agree to live in continence. When confronted with that teaching, one of the Pope's top people said, that was 30 years ago. I'm serious. That was 30 years ago. This is what's happening on the ideological front. The passage of a mere 30 years allows us to discard the teaching of a Pope that Francis just canonized. You see the acceleration that's going on. Here's another example. We know what's going on with the Franciscan Friars of the Immaculate. And the Leadership Conference of Women Religious in America is off on Mars in terms of heresy. They believe in something called conscious evolution, which is the total destruction of the Catholic faith. It's one size-fits-all heresy. And they're being coddled by the Vatican. The Franciscan Friars of the Immaculate are being crushed, dismembered, destroyed, murdered, canonically speaking, by the direct order of the Pope, as the Apostolic Commissioner has said repeatedly, and the Pope doesn't deny. Well, now the Franciscan Sisters of the Immaculate are under the thumb of the Vatican. They've been sent a progressivist observer who went to the UN conference on the empowerment of women and pronounced it a wonderful event. Now, the second in command at the Congregation for Consecrated Life, Jose Rodriguez Carballo, said this about the sisters. For the consecrated, the council is a point that cannot be negotiated. The entire church can go to blazes, but Vatican II must be defended. And he said that with the sisters we are seeing true deviations. From what? From doctrine? From sound liturgical practice? From the rule of life, of prayer? Of contemplation? Of poverty? No. Here's the deviation he's talking about. Not a few institutes, meaning the traditionalist institutes, the fraternity, of course, the Franciscan Friars, not a few institutes give not only a pre-conciliar, but even an anti-conciliar formation. This is inadmissible. It is to place oneself outside of history. It is something that worries us greatly in the congregation. This is what worries them, a deviation from history. Historicism has penetrated the thinking of churchmen, and the church now rides up and down and sideways on the currents of history and changes with the times. A Catholic style from the past is no longer acceptable. This is to ignore history. Now, this is ideology at work, not doctrine, not dogma, and it's a problem. What do we do about it? I'm going to conclude with a reference to an article by George Neumeyer, writing in the American Spectator. Mr. Neumeyer is not a traditionalist. He's not a sedevacantist. He's a middle-of-the-road, maybe right-of-center Catholic. And he, like Janet Smith, like Professor Orsini at Ave Maria Law School, like Germain Grisey, a world-renowned theologian of the Novus Ordo establishment who is no traditionalist, he's had enough. And he is saying what I've been saying throughout this talk. Here's the subtitle of his talk. Well, here's the title first. When Paul Corrected Peter. Subtitle. Laity and clergy should reject respectfully the liberalism of Pope Francis. And he cites St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas Aquinas speaks of St. Paul's famous rebuke of Peter because Peter refused to eat with the Gentiles. He was holding on to the old Jewish customs, sort of like a certain movement in the church today that we've seen on EWTN, featured many times. And this scandalized the potential Gentile converts. And so St. Paul came before Peter, stood up to him and said, "You cannot do this. Eat with the Gentiles. You're scandalizing the converts." He withstood Peter to his face. And Neumeyer says, citing St. Thomas, who cites St. Paul, which is a matter of revealed truth, all of this, says Neumeyer, is highly relevant to the pontificate of Francis. For the good of the faith, laity, clergy, bishops, and particularly powerful cardinals should start playing Paul to Francis's Peter. That is a very hard thing to say. I'm very hesitant to say that to any audience. But it's true. It's time to wake up and recognize the reality that we do have to play Paul to Francis's Peter. Now, Neumeier concludes by saying, has Pope Francis been paying attention for the last 50 years? The only vibrant religious orders are traditional ones. The only packed churches are traditional ones. Okay, the occasional Novus Ordo parish is packed because they've abolished all the other parishes around it and there's one mass. Has Pope Francis not been paying attention the last 50 years? The only vibrant religious orders are traditional ones. The only packed churches are traditional ones. The only seminaries producing shepherds for the flock are traditional ones. To use his analogy, the Catholic left's field hospitals, in them all the patients are dead. And then his last words, the need for a St. Paul to correct him, meaning the Pope, grows with each passing week as his pontificate emboldens the Church's enemies and undercuts her friends and most loyal members. I'm sorry, but it's true. I don't want to say this. I don't like saying it. I don't like what some of you are thinking because I have said it. It's not going to make me popular with everybody in this room. But it's true. We can't run away from the truth. Those who want to be silent and obey while the Church is ravished need to join the Be Silent and Obey movement. And as for me, I will remain part of the movement that refuses to consent to the auto-demolition of the Church. Because part of being a Catholic is to recognize the signs of the times. How ironic that Vatican II called upon us to do this, and yet churchmen have refused to. Sometimes obedience to authority would destroy the obedience of faith. And when obedience destroys obedience, how can one obey? Thank you.
In the final vision on October 13, 1917, Our Lady silently held out the scapular, a gesture which indicates that she wants everyone to wear it.